to our session. Welcome to our session today. My name is Mario Molina, and I am the chair of this room. We had another chair, but he had a problem this morning, so he's not going to be able to join us, right? It's my pleasure to be here. Now, in this room, we're going to have 3 different presentations, right? We're going to start with the first one. Let me just project or show you my screen. This is the first group of presenters. This is our first presentation. The title is A Qualitative Study of European Students' Psychological Well-Being in Acculturation to China. The presenters are Chongwan Zhu and Renzu Peng, both from Huazhong University of Science and Technology. And we also have Weiping Wu from Wuhan University of Technology. So let's welcome our 3rd presenters.
Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone in this room. I'm Ren Zhongpeng from Huazhong University of Science and Technology. My team members are Professor Weiping Wu from Wuhan University of Technology and Dr. Chongguang Zhu from Huazhong University of Science and Technology. Our research topic is about acculturation and psychological well-being among European students in China. I will introduce research background and method part of this research. And Dr. Zhu will talk about results and the discussion. Professor Wu will present conclusion, recommendations, and limitations of this research. Now, allow me to talk about it. I will share the screen. Just moments. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this. Just moments.
You can present now.
Yeah, okay, now okay. Can you hear my screen? Can you see my screen?
We can hear you, but we cannot see your screen.
Okay, sorry. Just moments.
You can send it to me and I can show it here if you want. Okay, I think it's good.
How about now? Can you see the screen?
Yes,
okay,
we can
great.
see it now.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. I'm not familiar with.
Don't worry.
Okay. So allow me to talk about the research, our research background. The previous, okay, here, yeah. Previous studies have found that international students often experience challenges with psychological well-being in acculturation process, such as loneliness, stress, discrimination, prejudice, and depression. There is a considerable amount of research conducted on international students' psychological acculturation in China, mostly focusing on Asian and African international students' psychological stress, depression, and other psychological health problems. However, fewer studies have taken a particular consideration of European students' psychological well-being in acculturation in China. So this study explored European students' acculturation and psychological well-being in China through semi-structured interviews and utilized the coding analysis method to analyze the interview data from the help of NVivo 12. We hope this research will help understand European students' psychological well-being in the acculturation process in China. Okay, now this research includes the 4 steps. Step 1, this study generated in the interview protocol and refined it by a pilot study. Step 2, 10 European students were chosen from 6 Chinese universities. Step 3, 10 semi-structured interviews were conducted to collect interview materials. Step 4, we analyzed the data and coded the interview scripts by using NVivo 12. From the sampling process and the data collection, the 10 European students participated in the interview, 6 male and 4 females with an average age of 26 years old. From the data analysis, this study adopted open coding, axial coding, and selective coding methods to analyze the qualitative data through a grounded approach by using NVivo 12. In open coding, we obtained 93 nodes. In axial coding, we obtained 7 parent nodes and 15 child nodes. In selective coding, we identified 3 co-themes to guide the nodes. That's the table of this data analysis. In this table, we have the 3 core themes and 7 parent nodes and 15 child nodes. Now, let's welcome the Dr. Zhu will talk about results and discussion.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And
Yes.
can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, you
Yes.
can see your screen now.
Okay. Okay, hi everyone. I will present the results and discussion section. And as mentioned in the data analysis section, there are 3 core themes. And firstly, I will present the first core theme, acculturative stress. As you can see from the table, there are 3 parent nodes in this beyond this theme. And also there are 7 child nodes beyond each parent nodes. Let's start from the first parent node, the living stress. And there are 3 child nodes beyond this parent node. Firstly, some participants, they regard sharing a room with other students or changing the room and changing the double room into a single room are stressful experiences. And also they encounter some stressful situations such as being fooled by the taxi driver in China, and also some identification problems in online car hauling, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. And also they encounter some problems when dealing with some banking services. For example, Y6 stated that it was a little bit stressful at first that you have to share a room. And also they said it takes a long time to fit into a banking system, and they have to wait such a long hour to fix the problem. And then in the second parent node, academic stress, we can see there are 2 child nodes beyond this node. The first one is support from universities. They encounter the stress in because of the school's low efficiency in notification and administration, and also because of the lack of guidance in administration services. Also, they encountered the problems in the communication with Chinese teachers. For example, they said in Germany, sometimes the communication field is more equal, but in China, teachers always are higher than you, they said. About the third parent node, social stress, they encounter the stress in the Chinese proficiency. It's interesting that almost all European students had realized the necessity or the importance of learning Chinese before they came to China. However, they still encounter the stressful situations for the lack of Chinese proficiency. For example, he said, I thought I was able to speak better Chinese than I actually couldn't. And then they encountered the intercultural misunderstandings and conflicts, such as being taken photos without his or her permission, and also the physical contact, and also the differences between the direct and the indirect communication style in conversation. And to summarize, experiencing acculturated stress is a very common phenomenon among European students in China, and also the issues in the living domain and was identified as major stressors, especially during the COVID-19 epidemic. And we suggested that the problem-focused strategy and emotion-focused strategies can be adopted to alleviate the stress. And then comes to the second core theme, is the feelings of alienation. And beyond this theme, there are 2 parent nodes and 4 child nodes. The first parent node is academic alienation. It refers to the formal relationship between European students and Chinese people. And some participants had a low level of academic alienation because they actively involved in the school activities. However, the participation frequency gradually declined afterward, according to some reasons. For example, he said, I did participate in those activities in the first semester, but not really afterward anymore. And those who maintained a high level of academic alienation, they, as Y9 said, in the laboratory, he was always working on something and never had any help from anybody. And the second child node beyond the feelings of alienation is social alienation. Also, there are 2 levels beyond this parent node. We can see some students, some participants, they established the active informal relationship with students and also the faculties in their universities. And to summarize this thing, the results indicate that the low degree of alienation promotes psychological well-being. And the affecting factors include the lack of support in academic assignment, and also the cultural distance between European countries and China. So the universities may collaborate with various student organizations, and especially some associations, clubs, and also the part of the Department of Dormitory to help European students build communities and the informal networks in China. And as for the last core thing, self-concept, also there are also 2 parent nodes and 4 child nodes in this theme. Firstly is academic self-concept. A lot of participants, they are not so much satisfied with their academic performance, so they had an average level of academic self-concept. For example, a participant said, I think my academic performance is 50-50, and in Chinese, maybe like mama hu hu. And also, the other participants, they had a high level of academic self-concept. They merely evaluated their academic performance from the high attendance at class and the good marks of courses and their academic achievements. The second parent node, social self-concept, a lot of participants, they had a positive social self-concept. For example, Y10 said he helped the organization or in the United States, in their universities, and he helps a lot of friends, and they had a lot of Chinese friends. So he gave him a lot of help. And then the low level of social concept, there's only 1 participant that said he didn't have the high level of social self-concept in China. And to summarize this thing, almost all interviewees had a high level of self-concept in social relationships in China. And the affecting factor is found to be the social integration. And their evaluations on academic performance might result from these factors: goals achievement in academic studies, and the communication between Chinese teachers, and also the learning efficacy in COVID-19 epidemic. And finally is the Chinese proficiency. And we suggest that the measures such as adjusting their goals of achievement, of academic achievement, and also the improvement of their Chinese proficiency might help them to develop their academic self-concept, and then help them relieve the stress and benefit their psychological well-being. Okay, let's welcome Professor Wu to give us the conclusion part and the recommendations.
Okay, now let's go to the conclusion part. This study explored psychological well-being in acculturation among European students in China through a qualitative analysis of the interview materials using NVivo 12. This study has found that experiencing acculturative stress is a common phenomenon among European students in China, and issues in the living domain will identify as the major stressors in their acculturation process, particularly during the COVID-19 period. Concerning feelings of alienation, most participants experienced a relatively low level of alienation in the academic dimension, and few participants had a high level of social alienation with a feeling of separation and estrangement from Chinese people. The research findings also indicate that most of them had a high level of self-concept in social relationships. However, few participants had a high self-concept in academic performance. The evaluation is related to social integration, language proficiency, and goals achievement. Based on the research findings, several suggestions and recommendations for acculturation were proposed. On the one hand, this research enriches theoretical understandings of European students' psychological well-being in acculturation in China. It also provides an overview for the further quantitative measurement of European students' psychological well-being. On the other hand, this study has practical implications for European students in universities to promote European students' psychological well-being and facilitate European students' acculturation process. For European students, particular emphasis should be put on the development of foreign language proficiency and intercultural competence. The suggestions for universities focus on providing coordination and psychological health support to students and the improvement of information guidance for consulting and the quality of bilingual consultancy. Despite significant and interesting findings presented in the previous section, this study has limitations and weaknesses. Although the files and sources of interview materials reach the saturation of quantitative data, and the nationality of participants covers 6 European countries, a large number of interviewees and a wider range of interviewees' nationalities should be considered to improve the reliability of the results in this study. Thanks a lot for listening. Then questions are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. By the way, perfect timing, right? Thanks for keeping that in mind. Yeah, so we have about about 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, go ahead. Salim.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you for the presentation. I just would like to ask a question about the sample. What was the standards behind like selecting the sample in the countries? you said a bunch of European countries, but I just would like to know the standard of the selecting the sample. Did you have guys any kind of features of selecting the European countries? Why these exactly European countries in particular? Why not others? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your question. And for the for the participant selection, and we try our best to meet the requirements of the various countries in the European European countries, such as Germany and the United States and the United Kingdom, and also the Eastern European countries such as Russia and Ukraine. But for the COVID-19 for the COVID-19 epidemic, it's very hard to get access to those to European students from other countries. So we've tried our best to get access to those samples. But as said in our limitations, I think the number of participants are not various to meet the standards, I think. So that is one of our limitations.
Thank you. Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salim, for that question. Please remember, you can also use the chat box for more questions. And Salim, you still have your hand up. Is that an old hand, or you still have another question?
I'm sorry, just a mistake. I'm sorry. I didn't really mean to ask another question. Just I don't know how this happened. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No problem. Yeah, well, I actually have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask my first question. It is clear that because of the cultural differences and the lack of language proficiency, students are having problems to integrate, right? Socially, and they're also having some academic problems, it looks. So you recommended programs to give support to these students. Are there any types of existing programs at the moment that provide support to international students, or those are non-existent?
So in China, in some Chinese universities, such as, for example, in our universities, Huazhong University of Science and Technology, there are some organizations organized by some students. They will voluntarily help those international students to better adapt to China, both in academic domain and also in the living domains. So there do exist some organizations and clubs to help them.
The student level, and those are volunteers, right? So
yeah.
You do have some in place, but it looks like it's not enough. You might need more, right?
Yeah. So
okay.
I think it's a system, a complete system, support system should be built to help them.
Perfect. Thank you. And then my second question is, in your recommendations, you included further quantitative research. Do you have any ideas on how to conduct this? How are you planning to conduct this, or how do you think other researchers can do this?
So our research team will further, we try to use the grounded theory, a grounded approach to find some affecting factors to affect European students' psychological well-being, and then we will use these factors to try to construct a scale to measure their psychological well-being in China, and that's the further study the further study to this presentation. Yeah.
Be like a survey, probably, maybe a survey, a larger scale.
Yeah, we might to create a scale and then apply the scale to try to measure their psychological well-being. Yeah, that's the quantitative research.
Thank you very much. Perfect. We have one more question here. So, Dongjin.
Yes, hello. Thank you all for sharing a wonderful study. I have been wondering, because China has been gone through a lot of phases of COVID. Maybe you've already presented this, but I missed the details. I wonder which phase of COVID is probably the first phase of COVID might be the most significant for the European students, right? So I wonder when the interviews were conducted and what phases are they talking about?
So actually this 10 interviewees were conducted after the first phase of COVID-19 in Wuhan. Yeah.
It's like a March, like last year, somewhere after March 2020.
Last year, August and September.
In August. I see. Yeah, I see. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it does really make a difference, right? The time of the year.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. And I think it's time to welcome the next group of presenters, all right? Thank you again to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Well, next will be us.
Yes, I think so. Let me just show my screen here.
Let me see.
And
I'm going
yes,
to share my presentation and see if
I'm actually perfect. I'm going to introduce you guys and then you can just show your presentation. All right.
Okay. Let me stop sharing right now. All right.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Presenters. All right. So let's welcome our next group of presenters. The title of this presentation is Communicating COVID-19 in Multilingual Tibet, a Culture-Centered Approach. And our presenters are Dongjin Kan from Florida Gulf Coast University and Puba from Southwest Mizzou University. So let's welcome our two presenters.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Molina Nar. So let me first of all share my screen. Share, let's see, not sure if it's showing right now. All right, I wonder if you all can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
It showed up, right? Okay, so it's still a few minutes before should I get started or should I wait?
I think you can get started. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I'll time myself. I know I have 20 minutes. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches. So these are the Spanish phrases I trained myself to speak while living in Florida. Today, my student Puba and I are going to share with you our project, Communicating COVID-19 in Multilingual Tibet, a culture-centered approach. And you may ask why it's not intercultural centered approach. So I'll share with you why. Well, first of all, I would like to share with us a little bit of preview. Today, I want to introduce the purpose of the study and also the background of the study, because you may wonder what is multilingual Tibet. And then we'll talk about literature review and our theory, the culture-centered approach. And next, I'll have Puba share with us our methods and analysis. I will talk about the key themes, conclusion, and potential implications. So first of all, I'd like to share with everybody our project, the global challenges, those backgrounds and the opportunities. I believe language is really vital in communicating COVID-19 in health mandates with the indigenous communities globally, especially multilingual communities. And our purpose is to use a culture-centered approach to explore how Tibetans develop and enact health choices, or a lack thereof across cultures during COVID-19 pandemic in the multilingual Com-Tibetan region in China. So when I say across cultures, I meant scientific cultures and indigenous cultures and standard language cultures and regional language cultures. So I'm sure we define cultures differently. So here, cross cultures, just to give some examples to clarify. And then as for multilingual Tibet, what does it mean? So when I first started learning Tibet, the lesson 1 tells me, it means every district has its own dialect and every Lama has its own doctrine. So as a student, I was really confused about 10 years ago, which language am I really speaking? And people from another part of Tibet would not even understand what I was saying. So this will lead to an introduction of where is Tibet. For most of the time, even for my friends in China, they would ask, doesn't Tibet just mean Tibetan Autonomous Region in this part, Southwest China? And not really. There are actually 5 provinces in China Tibetans are resided in 5 provinces in China, and there are multiple languages that are spoken in Tibet. As you can see here, I colored 3 major ethno-linguistic communities. They're called Yutang, Kam, and Andu. So they are basically developed in Yuan Dynasty in China. So the 3 ethno-linguistic communities are pretty much like the Romance languages, like Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, and they are not easily intelligible. It takes a lot of effort for people from different regions to understand what each other are saying. So especially in our research side in Kham area. So in Kham, the situation is even more complicated. So we call this multilingual Kham. Tibetans in Kham speak the Kham Tibetan variation and 26 long-Tibetic tongues. So for Tibetic tongues, the 3, for example, the 3 regions I introduced to you, however, with the non-Tibetic language, it's very much like a Chinese and Burmese. It's basically mutually unintelligible at all. It's very, very different language system. And here, especially these 26 non-Tibetic tongues, that's really hard to understand. And most of them don't even have a written script. And most of them are endangered and unclassified, unfortunately. So here it will lead to our challenges. Based on the literature review, we try to understand how interculturality and language influence our participants' health choices. Our participants are basically Tibetan speakers and non-Tibetic speakers residing in Kham region. So interculturality here, I actually found a lot of definitions, but I found the Dr. Diaz one from, he's from University of Mexico. He defined interculturality as relations that exist within society between diverse majority and diverse majorities and minorities contestations. So that majority group or minority group, they're not just one or not just a dualistic concept. They're actually multiple majorities and multiple minorities. So here it's gonna make this case a little bit more complex, right? In addition to that, we find the second facet of definition of interculturality focuses on the possibility of generating shared cultural expression through dialogue and mutual respect. So here, dialogue is one of our core concepts. As we continue to survey our literatures, we find some common barriers on health disparity and health choices in indigenous communities or minority communities, especially intercultural communication. The studies in North America, Canada, and New Zealand, most of the literatures are indicating the lack of English proficiency and accommodation among lower income immigrant communities are problematic, and they're negatively influencing their health choices. Or they're creating disparity because of the lack of proficiency in English language. Second, in the second area, whereas the public health sector researchers who focuses on language and culture identifies language and culture primarily as a channel or medium of communication. So there are a number of studies that are done in East Africa focusing on the channel, how the musicians using music to communicate the COVID-19 measures. And also we can see a lot of research has been published in China focused on deliberation of emotional narratives on social media that would influence the public health choices. In Ghana, seeing some in multiple languages. So these are quite interesting studies and laid out the foundation for us to explore how interculturality and health choices has been developed. However, how they're developed across languages in indigenous communities like Tibet has not carefully studied. That's why we turned to a very interesting theory that's called culture-centered approach. So cultural-centered approach initiated by Dr. Mohan Duda and his colleagues understand that how persons in indigenous or subaltern communities develop their agency in the interaction of structure, culture, and agency within the three elements. So as for culture, Dr. Duda defined this as the system of organizing that enable and or constrain the access of resources. Culture here, I'm sure we all have our own definitions of culture, but I want to focus more on the co-cultures. Co-cultures where people share value, practices, and meanings that negotiate in the communities. They're dynamic, fluid, and sometimes fragmented. So culture is not always coherent. Whereas agency, that's the focus of our study, we want to focus on how Tibetans enact their multi-axis actions of everyday choices and decisions by community members, even amid the structural constraints that reflect the daily negotiation of structures through dialogue co-construction. Here we rely primarily on Bakhtin and Ferry, so I'll explain that later on in the analysis. So with this guide, we explore two research questions. First of all, how do Tibetans describe and make sense of COVID? Especially, how do they make sense of COVID-19 through translations? How COVID-19 or coronavirus is translated into multiple Tibetan languages in Kham region. Second, we want to understand how do Tibetans develop COVID-19 health choices across language difference within the People's Republic of China's health management system. So guided by these two research questions, I would like to invite my student Puba to share with us the research method. Okay, Puba, can you hear me? Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Puba, a graduate student studying applied linguistics at Southwest Minzu University. My hometown is called Baiyu, as you can see in the map. I speak Kham regional languages and Chinese languages. Today, I am going to share with you the methods of the research. First, I used the snowball sampling strategy and I conducted 30 interviews from May to October 2021. 50 men and 50 women participated in the interview. All of them were born and raised in Gansu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Sichuan province. Second, 18 interviews were conducted in Kham regional languages. 2 participants' native languages are not clearly classified. In addition, 7 of them use Sichuanhua and 5 use Chinese Putonghua. Third, we used semantic analysis to analyze the data. Before we share with you the key themes, I want to introduce you the top 5 phrases used in Tibetan to describe the COVID-19. First, the most frequently used term is Doyin Nedu, translated as coronavirus. The second most frequent one is Nguine infectious disease. But most interesting one is Lotsenjairma, translated as the lung disease as an eruption rebound, often used by Tibetan monks in the monasteries. Next, Dr. Khan will talk about the key themes. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Puba, for sharing with us the method. So based on our analysis, we actually translated all the interview transcript from Tibetan to Chinese, because about half of our participants use the Chinese varieties in the interview. We use the open coding and focused coding. Basically, we use the focused coding to analyze the Tibetan terms across all the regional variations. So I'd like to share with you our initial analysis. We have basically 3 themes. The first, the key thing is called inaction with fear and confidence. As you can see here, many of you know, there is a pretty much authoritarian top-down health communication structure in China. It enabled the COVID precaution measures, but at the same time, the biomedical lingua franca Chinese and Tibetan language did not really warrant a meaningful action. So here, I would like to share with you some of our participants' narratives. So one of our first participant, Norbu, who speaks one of the common varieties, he's 29 years old and a farmer. He said that when the pandemic situation in our county, sorry, there's a typo, was severe, the local government used the mobile speakers, WeChat groups, and the specialized translators. They call the translators educators or educational cadres to translate the COVID-19 precautionary measures. When the Dao County, one of the Tibetan counties, has a lot of cases, I don't know what to do, simply because I was so scared after hearing the news in Chinese. As you can see here, fear was one of the key themes that reported among most of our participants. In addition to that, a younger woman, Ramo, who is a college student, said that we don't really know what is COVID called because we don't hear it in our original languages. Villagers at home don't think we could be infected, and there was not any sense of crisis. Our family called it lotse. It just refers to general non-disease. In addition to that, Gyano, 43 years old, a Tibetan monk, said that in many rural villages, my family called it Gyana Lotse. Gyana here means the Han Chinese regions. So basically, there are a lot of confidence within Tibetan communities because they believe they're not going to be infected, and the lung disease, the coronavirus, come from the Han regions, because there are a lot of structural issues between inter-ethnic groups. So unfortunately, this fear and confidence that has been preventing our Tibetan participants from actively participating in COVID precautionary measures. Second, our second key thing, we call the inconvenient language struggle and opportunities. So in this theme, I focus on the insensitivity to minoritized language, especially the non-Tibetic language that can reinforce the healthcare inequality among non-Tibetic language speakers, but at the same time created opportunity for those minority languages to develop its co-culture languages. So as you can see here from the map, there are really, like what Bakhtin says, are multi-level of centripetal and the centrifugal discourses. There are multiple centers when it comes to language that are used in Kham region. So Chinese language varieties are basically a dominant language, and then in Kham Tibet, as you can see, Kham Tibetan languages varieties are basically the other center, whereas the non-Tibetic languages are basically at the margin. Here, we're lucky that we actually interviewed 2 non-Tibetic language speakers. So a Drapa speaker from Dawu said that both Tibetans and Naxi ethnicity live in our region. Our village use Xinguan in Chinese, in Sichuanhua, when talk about the new coronavirus. It's very hard for us to understand Tibetan language news. Some elders understand it a bit. I feel so strange when I first heard about it. The village educator, Kadrit, said it's extremely dangerous. If it broke out, I'm sure our whole village are going to be totally wiped out. So for most of the inconvenient languages, the non-Tibetic terms were completely ignored when it comes to media. There is a collective news. For example, the Com television, they would speak primarily the Com variety, but not non-Tibetic language. Similarly, a Minyak speaker, Yeshi Ladro, said that the Minyak language does not have a written script. We feel this disease is like cancer or something that would easily terminate your life. We call it Enre Sapa. So basically, it's like a combination of Minyak language and a Com variety. Simply means a new disease. I don't really remember anything in Tibetan news about COVID. I heard a lot of them on TV or on social media. Some local officials visited our house to educate us. I could not leave the house at all during the Wuhan lockdown. I'm afraid that it will be very troubling. I'm afraid I would be troubling the country if I walk out. I didn't care about if myself got infected. My life simply does not matter. So this reaction, the very passive reaction to COVID among the inconvenient language speakers has been an overarching thing. And unfortunately, this multi-level centripetal and centrifugal discourses somewhat they are serving as some kind of oppressive discourse when their familiar language is not in presence, not in the news, not on social media. However, at the same time, many of their villages actually developed their own COVID precaution videos, but this effort is just a body. All right, so let's shift our attention to the last thing we call dialogical co-construction of language with compassion. 9 out of 30 participants reported that social media has been one of their #1 information source during COVID-19 when they attempt to develop their health choices. So the 9 participants talked about one of the WeChat account called Yuto Teaching Tibetan. So Yuto is, I would say, a Tibetan elite educator. She has been quite influential in a lot of in a lot of cities and villages in Tibet. So our participants are very much embracing her content on social media. So one of our participants said, Teacher Yuto does not only teach Tibetan language, she's actually translating the biomedical language from Chinese to Tibetan. But most importantly, she talked about how to avoid scammers. So importantly, their health choices or her credibility is not about just COVID-19 information. She also talked about other issues that the Tibetan care about, like avoid scammers. And our second participant talked about that from monks to migrant workers and nomads, everyone understood what she was saying. She did not just read the COVID news, she analyzed the news with us. We sent messages to her, and the next day she would answer our question. So as you can see, there is a dialogue going on between persons in the villages and also on social media. Our last participant mentioned that the villagers at home understand the way she speaks. We discuss her podcast when families are gathering or when friends are drinking together. When the cadres request us to stay home and quarantine, well, we agree that the strict lockdown is necessary. So here, I would say dialogue here rely on polyphony. This is more translatable understanding and it's unfinalizable as educators. So grassroots social media influencers, they basically serve as educators, just like what Ferry said, education is simultaneously an act of knowing, a political act, and also an artistic event. So I will wrap up really quickly. In addition to one of the elitist WeChat account, we also heard participants talk about the agency developed from the bottom up. a lot of folk song singers would sing the Gusar epic, use the Gusar epic, and this is very much like the Tibetan rap song, contemporary rap song. Many of these folk singers use metaphors. For example, the viruses are as parasites from Tibetan medical tantra. So medical tantra was developed basically about 800 years ago. So there are a lot of cultural values embedded there. So it's much easier for Tibetans to understand and make sense of COVID-19. So with those three things, we had a very brief conclusion. We believe that our project is attempted to decolonize the Tibetan victim image in the global media. And here we analyze the multifaceted agency Tibetans can enact. Second, we believe that intercultural, inter-ethnic communication should come from a de-Han-centric perspective, especially we analyze the health systems in China. In addition to that, we should focus on the knowledge production, especially the Tibetan science or Tibetan study of healing as an important way of knowing. For our theoretical contribution, we believe that we added the co-culture component in the culture-centered approach for Dr. Mohan Dutta. And we also have two practical contributions focusing on, or even a critical opponent about the Tibetan language become a decoration with countless careless errors on the so-called bilingual media. So we have to point out those restraints. And we hope that the multilingual social network, and we can see that they become the defining factor for health choices rather than literacy or urban-rural divide. All right. So to end our project, we believe this project serves as a global challenge and a global opportunity for indigenous communities. And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, muchas gracias. Tujiche or xie. All right.
Thank
Any
you.
questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ken and Puba, for this wonderful presentation. Very interesting. The Tibet does really look like a multilingual society, right? So thanks for sharing that information with us. So we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand or you can write it in the chat box. So
looks like we need more coffee.
Probably. Yeah, I can actually, I have a couple of questions. Well, but before that, we have a few questions here on the chat box already. Let me read those, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the first minute of your chat, so perhaps you mentioned it, but I wanted to know what drew you to study this in Tibet and in the first place. That is the first question. And I'm just going to go ahead and read the second question, wondering how the research influenced the policy-making process.
All right, so we'll start with the first question. What do I, okay, so this is more personal question because my grandpa was a first generation Han migrant to Tibet, actually. My mom was born, raised in Tibet, and I'm probably the third generation. I didn't grow up in Tibet, but it's more like a family influence in terms of my interest. I developed my interest in Tibetan language. My dissertation focuses on Tibetan language, especially minority language revitalization. During COVID times, I actually was very attentive to what's going on in Tibet, even I live in Florida. My student Puba and I, we constantly were talking about, oh, why aren't there any collective term translated from COVID? For example, in English language, there are a development of translation in terms of COVID-19. Well, we started here in the US, we started hearing, oh, Chinese virus, right? And then we heard the coronavirus, and then COVID, here it's COVID-19, and every language become more coherent through a fragmented process, right? So we we become really curious how this process would look like in Tibet, especially the most multilingual region, Kham Tibet. So we actually find so many variations of translations, and actually translations has been the translation of biomedical language actually highly influence our people around us, especially Tibetans around us, influence their health choices. And that's why we initiated this study, started from people around us, started from people we know. And of course, they directed us, and then the result actually surprised us a lot. Anyway, I hope I answered your question, Emilia. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So would you like to, the second question, how the research can influence the policy-making process?
I would say for policy-making process, I'm not sure how this project can influence the policy making at this point, because this is really the first step. I would say in the next 2 to 3 years, I would look for collaboration. I've been working with some Chinese universities who are working on the media policy in the Kham Tibetan region, especially in southwest China. One of the universities I worked with is Sichuan University that have a Tibetan Studies Center. So we may start from there. I'm sure this project hopefully can end up with engaging multilingual media in Tibet. So this is basically what we see the direct connection with our Chinese colleagues. Yeah.
We have one more question and we have the time to answer it. So I'm going to read it. In your presentation, you mentioned that Tibet is a multilingual society. I am wondering who do the translation? Who do the translation among the different languages? What causes the translation errors? How your research will translation policy in Tibet?
Thank you, Professor Sean. This is a very difficult question. Thank you. I wish I knew who do the translation. Basically, if it's a governmental media account, basically the civil servants, the 公务员 would be the one, the bilingual 公务员 would be the one who did the translation work. And we found that many of those websites are basically using Tibetan as just a face work. You know, we are bilingual, but most of the time, younger generation just reads Chinese, right? So what's the point of using Tibetan? So these are the unresolved questions. It will lead to our second or third study after this project. What caused the translation errors? I'm not sure, maybe our first group of speakers talked about Chinese efficiency, right? Nowadays in China, we probably focus more on coordinating tasks and activity that may neglect the importance of non-Tibetan language or the inconvenient languages. I'm sure in Chinese institutions, we could encounter such similar understanding in terms of language. What would our research influence translation policy? Yeah, thank you. Again, I guess I answered briefly the question, how do we influence translation policy? I feel influencing policy is a long way to go, especially for us like scholars. We have to actively engage in the policy with policymakers, first of all. Yeah, so we'll just start with media and then see how far we go. Thank you, Dr. Sean. Let's see.
You have one last comment on the chat box.
Dr. Zhang, impressive for research, contract, social equality. All right, thank you for your comments, Dr. Zhang. Yeah, any suggestions, please feel free to contact me. I'll just write down my email there. If you have any comments or questions, and then feel free to email me Puba and I were working on revision of this manuscript. So hopefully it will end up somewhere next year.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Dr. Can and Puba. I would like to welcome the last group of presenters for our part of the session today. And let me just, well, it's actually one presenter, right? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for letting me know. So the title of this presentation is COVID-19 and Interculturality, Revisiting Assumptions about Intercultural Competence in Modern Language Degree Programs by Eleanor Parks from University of York and University of Manchester. Let's welcome Eleanor. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen. Okay, are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so I'll begin. I'll introduce myself first of all. So yeah, you introduced me already. I'm Eleanor Parks. I actually just recently started working for the University of Durham as well. So I will be mostly based in Durham from now on, and still with the University of York, although my contract with Manchester has now finished because I've transferred over. I'm predominantly, well, I'm teaching German as I was at Manchester as well. So what I'm looking at today, or the context of my research and my talk today, is the relevance of interculturality to the teaching of foreign languages, in particular German, within a UK context, so within higher education in the United Kingdom, and particular degree programs. But the focus, or one of the focuses in today's talk, is how COVID-19 has made us look at things differently and sort of challenge and reevaluate our understanding of intercultural competence within modern language degrees, and also how we think of certain established models and frameworks that we have been, citing for years now within the field of intercultural communication. So just a brief overview, we're going to look at some of the assumptions about intercultural competence in modern language degrees. And then look at two of the frameworks that informed my my study, which I used then to interpret the data that I collected. An overview of my doctoral study, which is based at the University of Hull, and the universities involved in that study, and students' development of intercultural communicative competence and criticality, again based on the study's findings. Then looking at COVID-19 and interculturality and how that has challenged certain assumptions and understandings of students' development of interculturality in language degrees, and new directions for the degree and higher education and beyond. So one of the expectations of modern language graduates is that they develop not only this linguistic competence in a foreign language, but also an intercultural competence. This has been stressed across a number of reports, both in the United States and in the UK. We see that in the modern, in the MLA report, it refers to, or states that students should develop a deep translingual and transcultural competence. Similar emphasis placed in the Wharton report. The QAA benchmark statement also highlights critical understanding and the ability of students or graduates to evaluate critically one's own culture. I'll get to this because it's an important point. There's a difference between an understanding and recognizing otherness, and then that critical evaluation of one's own culture, which is a step further, I would argue. More recently, in a joint statement, again, we see the emphasis placed on intercultural competencies as a desirable outcome of language degrees. And however, what we see predominantly is that there is a reliance on study abroad programs to develop this competence, and it has been suggested in several studies that the mere exposure to cultural differences while studying abroad does not ensure intercultural competence. Studies dating back 20 years back that have reported the same issues. Yet there's still a heavy reliance on study abroad programs, or the year abroad as being an element of the 4-year degree program as being the decisive factor in developing these skills. So how is IC defined and understood? There's many models, but perhaps the most influential are Byron's model of ICC and Deirdre's process model. One of the things to stress about Byron's model is the importance of critical cultural awareness, which was my main reason for choosing this among other models, is also because intercultural communicative competence takes into account the language, the role of language within the development of intercultural competence. In all of the 5 savoirs that Byron mentions, it's the 5th savoir which I felt was most relevant because it highlights the critical cultural awareness, which he defines as an ability to evaluate critically on the basis of explicit criteria, perspective, practices, and products in one's own and other cultures. So it's the idea of comparisons. However, this Byron's framework has also been sort of criticized because it seems to portray 2 cultures very much in a dualistic way, where there's one and the other, which is problematic for a number of reasons, because of the positionality, and also because for many individuals cannot identify with one single culture. They may be a hybrid of several different cultures. They may have parents that come from different countries, may have lived in the 3rd, worked in a 4th, and their identity is really comprised of a various mix of different cultures. So there are issues with that duality there. But the idea of the critical evaluation is, I thought, what can be really considered valuable within the framework. I then also looked at Barnett's conceptualization of criticality. Again, there are similarities here between Byron's 5th savoir of critical cultural awareness and Barnett's conceptualization of criticality. In particular, I looked at what he defines as the highest level of criticality, which is the idea of transformatory critique and the critique in action. He talks about the 3 domains, so a critique within the field of knowledge, where students might critique what they read, what they see in the media, and then the reconstruction of self, and this is then a self-reflection, or where they start to question how their own thoughts, their own beliefs have been shaped by the historical background of the country or countries in which they've lived in. And then a critique and action would be where students are then in a position where they can take action and actually speak up where they recognize something which they might consider as unfair or discriminatory, or in any case but they are actually in a position to take action. So what makes a good interculturalist? The tricky question to answer, but one of the perhaps important factors is the ability to negotiate their own cultural, social, and political identifications with those of others, the concept of negotiation, and And the idea is also that critical thinking towards one's own beliefs and actions towards others, so that we, rather than having this outward view of the other, where we're identifying the other as something, as the other, as the outward view, what we see as the other person, but we look at ourselves and recognize ourselves as other as well. Now, what role does language play? Now, one of the things that's been mentioned, again, in relation to in the development of intercultural competence, is that languaging, the concept of languaging by Phipps and Gonzalez, that it involves encounters with others, but also with ourselves, with our own expectations, false assumptions, likes and dislikes. So it's not just looking at language as a new code or a different code to say the same thing, but also looking at language as meaning, for its meaning-making potential, and how people exchange meanings across languages, which is not the same in all languages. So Simpson and Derwin mentioned one of the dangers of certain frameworks, certain established frameworks of intercultural competence, and particularly one against the use of monological voices when referring to the self and other. I've sort of touched upon this already, and they argue that there is an urgent need for dialogism in intercultural communication. So again, interculturality would involve a critical exploitation of the multiplicity of voices from self and other, allowing interlocutors to escape from impositions and monologism. So again, it looks at positionality and not positioning yourself as distinct, as separate from the other, but rather looking at these as constantly influencing each other. So just a bit about my study. It was based at the University of Hull, and I looked at the implications between the separation between language and content, so the language courses and sort of cultural studies courses on students' development of intercultural and competence in criticality. There's a mixed methods design involving questionnaires and interviews, and it comprised 4 universities, 2 based in the UK and 2 in the US. And I looked at finalist students of German. I also interviewed staff in heads of department, German language coordinators, and German lecturers. So quick overview of the findings. So all 4 institutions, in all 4 institutions, students referred to content modules, so the cultural studies modules, as the most influential strand, perhaps because this is where students engage with literature or with film studies, and the approach is more academic, and they're also engaging with a lot of academic reading, and the type of assignments are similar to what you would expect in a humanities subject rather than in a language class. There was also reference made to the year abroad, although again, particular staff or language lecturers highlighted the importance of explicit guidance. And then students viewed the target languages and medium instruction is both language and content modules positive. And yeah, also important is that while all students developed or indicated that they had developed some degree of intercultural competence, only a fraction could be really regarded as good interculturalists. Only a few could really demonstrate that they had reached that higher level of critical thinking. This sort of, one of the graphs is sort of replicates the same thing that I've already mentioned, that students felt that content modules provided a greater opportunity to develop critical cultural awareness compared to language modules. Again, so some of the things that were mentioned regarding the year abroad is that it's more when you're guided through, so the process of guidance, when you're engaging with text, and that's where the critical thinking is developed rather than just being abroad. One of the comments by the head of German said that generally lower level language courses do not present German culture in very critical ways. This is perhaps something that needs to be addressed in higher education, this split and difference between the way that cultures are portrayed in language courses, especially at lower level language courses, compared to the way they are critically explored at higher level cultural studies courses. Yeah, and then one of the students, this was really an exceptional student that I interviewed at University A, and this perhaps some of his comments really sort of highlight that he was able to, or had developed a higher level of criticality because he's challenged not only was not only able to challenge the knowledge that he was, or the text that he was involved in the reading of, but also his own values. He started to ask where his own political values had come from and what had influenced that. And then he mentioned that because of that, he actually wouldn't align himself with conservative politics anymore. So he's actually affected, so transformed him in some way. So the previous example again sort of highlights it's quite exceptional because, as Kranch pointed out, students rarely think about how their own cultural environment has been historically constructed. Yet there we have an example of someone who did reach that level. So these were again some other examples of other students who reached some level of some higher level of criticality. One student, for example, mentioned a content module. Again, this is German studies, so they looked at the Holocaust, and she said that it made her look at the genocides differently, and was then invited to a talk on about gypsies, and she was thinking a lot of how how we treat gypsies. The talk was given by a Holocaust survivor, so she made this link between how perhaps Jewish people were treated during the Holocaust and how we treat gypsies today. So again, that sort of could have also led to taking action in the world at some point in her life. Again, we want to think of intercultural or students' interculturality as something fluid, which is constantly in development. It doesn't just start at the beginning of their undergraduate degree, and we can't just say that they've achieved it or that they've reached a certain level of competence by the end of their four-year degree. It's something which is constantly changing and developing. I'll just skip a few. So let me just, okay, I also wanted just to discuss the difference. I've looked at the data and then sort of tried to look at who could sort of be classified according to Byron's term of sojourner, so someone who actually produces an effect on society, which challenges and questions unconscious beliefs and behaviors, and in comparison to the idea of a tourist that really hopes for the opposite effect, that nothing will really be changed. I think some people also mentioned, for example, some students going to Spain and they just have this image in their mind of what Spain looks like and what they're going to eat, and it's a very much of a tourist sort of idea. The same could be said about Germany and maybe taking part in an Oktoberfest, and again, going with that mindset can sometimes also sort of impede that development of criticality, because they already have an idea of what they're going to see, what they're going to experience when abroad. So an example of a sojourner from University D. This was an interesting example. So this was actually a student who took part in a talk, and there was one of the students who was invited was a Muslim student wearing a headscarf, and yes, they had talked a lot about it in one of the courses, and then she said that the way that I could analyze and think that I could respond to people, I wouldn't have had the tools talk about it if I hadn't taken this class. It was basically a student who was somebody who was wondering what was in her backpack, and she saw that as a sign of discrimination. And basically were sort of suspicious about her being a Muslim student who compared to other students who were attending this talk. Okay, so yeah, this was also an example of sort of a rather poor example of a sort of unsuccessful year abroad experience. We can tell by the terminology that is used. This student refers to the natives as the Germans, and when asked if her experience has changed her beliefs, she said, "I don't think it has changed any beliefs. I've learned a lot. I've looked at things differently, but nothing specific." And this is also quite a negative example where, again, this is view of the other, in this case, the Germans, as different from her. And she's focusing on the differences and quite a negative experience, saying that when I left in a tram in Germany, nobody will let me get on the lift. So she's attributed that as a different way of, or different courtesy in a negative way. So this is also an important point that came up in one of the interviews, is that when asked if students sort of recognize themselves as British, or see that the others recognize them or see them as British when they're abroad, and the head of German at University B said that doesn't really come up, that they don't really see themselves as a foreigner, they see the other as a foreigner, even though they're in Germany. And again, they attribute the differences to the Germans and not to themselves. So there's this still this issue, and this was actually a very similar finding at University D, which was in the United States, which University B was in the UK. When asked if students view themselves as Americans, the head of German responded that may be another step to realize that there's somebody is looking at them as the Americans and not sure that they're at that level. So again, we see that there's sort of an outward view in both contexts.
Excuse me, Eleanor. Yeah. One more minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to skip on the part relating to COVID, because that's really sort of important. So one of the, in terms of COVID, what was the initial response? We noticed that there was a lot of, when people first started wearing face masks in the UK or in the West generally, because the WHO was actually recommending people not to wear face masks, there was a bit of a sort of stereotyping really when East Asian students at university, for example, were wearing face masks when others were not. And this was just prior to the lockdown in the UK. And this sort of idea that, do you have the virus? Because that's why you're wearing a face mask. Whereas, there was a misunderstanding or lack of understanding on the reasons why some students may have chosen or may have regarded wearing a face mask as the best protection for them, considering the context. Whereas at the time in the UK, we were actually told that it was not necessary. Interestingly enough, the recommendation has now changed. So everyone's, there was a point when everybody was wearing face masks. But it has been pointed out that, one of the central constructs of interculturalism is the notion of differences employed to demarcate the cultural difference of the other, rather than looking at similarities, we're looking at difference. Again, one of the things that came up in early 2020 is also the discrimination that that people who looked Chinese or remotely looked Chinese were facing at the time. We saw that in the movement on Twitter. We see this in French Chinese person who started. This was trending also on the BBC. The I am not a virus, which was then also in different languages, appeared in different languages across Europe. So one of the things that has come out of the pandemic, and then also
Right.
the 2020. Sorry, if you just give me a
Excuse
couple
me,
of
Eleanor.
minutes.
Yes. No, I understand. Well, we're actually a little bit behind with our schedule, and I wouldn't really like to.
I do have like a couple of slides, and then just a couple of slides left.
So we're not going to have any time for questions. That is the problem. And maybe somebody wants to ask a question. So I would really like to give the floor to the audience, just in case people have questions, because the presentation has been extremely interesting, especially for the reality of many immigrants in the UK and many European countries. So if anybody has any questions, would you please go ahead and ask those? We actually have 5 minutes.
Okay.
And I do have a question.
Yeah, that's fine.
I
don't think I have much left. I think there's a couple of slides that are related to this. Other than that, I'm done.
Okay.
Did you want to ask a question now? I mean, that's fine. We can discuss the question now.
I can go ahead and ask the question. I am a language teacher myself, so I found this extremely interesting. And my question is, did you ever notice that language was a barrier or represented a barrier for the students to take part in the discussions, in the modules, in the courses? Because the topics are really interesting. For example, the Holocaust or terrorism, you know, did language ever represent a barrier for the students?
Yeah, I think a lot of, one of the issues that I didn't mention in my presentation today, again, because I wanted to focus on the other aspects, but one of the questions that I asked my students is, in which modules were taught in the target languages, which were not. And predominantly the cultural studies modules were taught in English, with the exception of one university in the United States where all of the teaching was in German at all levels. And then one of the universities in the UK where it was mixed, whereas most of the teaching was done in German and some of it was done in English. But at two other universities, most of the cultural studies teaching was done in English, and that's actually a common practice at many UK universities. There's the downside of that is obviously that students are exposed to the target language less, and therefore given less opportunity to develop those higher level language skills in order to be able to actually speak in the target language, or within that kind of seminar context. The advantage is that students are fluent in English and are probably less reluctant to speak and are able to articulate more in terms of critical awareness, or just developing a critical opinion and on a topic. That particular course was taught in German on the Holocaust, but again, I believe it was a final year course. So these are students who come in with an A level in German, so B1, B2 level, and then have been at university, have already returned from their year abroad, so their language skills are quite developed.
Thank you very much. Eleanor, would it be possible for you to type your email account on the chat box, or maybe you can, if you have it on the slides?
I have it on the slide.
Perfect. If you can please show it. It looks like it's time for it's picture time. All right.
Yeah.
So let's just wait. I'm just going to wait a few seconds for you to show it on the slides.
Okay.
Show your email, because some people might be interested in contacting you.
Yeah.
This. Okay, so it's at the bottom. All right. I'm also going to write it here for type. Okay, Eleanor, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. Okay, we have about 1 minute for the picture, and then after that, we're going to move back to the main room because we have the research. Please open your cameras, and Eleanor, if you could please stop sharing your screen so we can see all the pictures. Thank you very much. When I say 3, right, we will smile. 1, 2, 3. All right, let me take one more just in case. Let me just paste it here. And I'll do it again. Hold on just a minute. Yes, there you go. 1, 2, 3. There you go. Thank you very much.